My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and write a comment, and we begin. My parents sold my grandmother's house behind my back. It's a sentence that I repeat in my head sometimes, a mantra of disbelief and simmering rage. Each time I say it, the bitterness sharpens, the wound festers. It wasn't just a real estate transaction. It was a violation, a deep and personal betrayal that shattered my trust in the people who were supposed to love and protect me. That house wasn't just bricks and mortar, a structure of wood and paint. It was a living, breathing entity, infused with the spirit of my grandmother, Margaret, a woman whose love and warmth had shaped my entire life. It was a tangible link to my childhood, a portal to a simpler, more innocent time. It was more than just a place. It was a feeling, a memory, a part of my very soul. It was a classic American colonial, painted a soft, faded yellow, with crisp white trim and black shutters. The defining feature was the wraparound porch, a sprawling expanse of weathered wood where Grandma would spend her afternoons, sipping iced tea and watching the world go by. I remember countless hours spent on that porch, listening to her stories, playing endless games of checkers, and feeling the gentle breeze on my skin. The garden was another world entirely, a riot of color and scent. Roses in every imaginable shade bloomed in abundance, their velvety petals heavy with fragrance. There were beds of lavender, peonies, and hydrangeas, all lovingly tended by Grandma's green thumb. I spent hours helping her weed, plant, and prune, learning the names of every flower and the secrets to keeping them healthy and vibrant. And the kitchen. It was the heart of the house, a warm and inviting space that always smelled of freshly baked apple pie, cinnamon rolls, or whatever culinary masterpiece Grandma was whipping up. It was in that kitchen that I learned to cook, standing beside her on a rickety wooden stool, carefully measuring ingredients and absorbing her wisdom. She taught me the secrets of her amazing recipes, the ones that had been passed down through generations, the ones that tasted like love and comfort. That kitchen was sacred. But the most sacred thing was her will, with the clause that stated, "To my granddaughter Allison, I give the right of first refusal to my home, to keep the memory going and the house loved." The clause was added to the will in writing, because she wanted Allison to have it specifically. I spent every summer at that house, from the time I was a toddler until I was practically grown. Those summers were the highlight of my year, a magical escape from the pressures and anxieties of everyday life. I'd arrive in June, bursting with anticipation, and leave in August, heartbroken to say goodbye. Those memories were the best part of my life, and I could never forgive those that destroyed the home that housed those memories. So, when my grandmother passed away a few years ago, leaving the house to my parents, I took solace in the fact that it would remain in the family, a tangible reminder of her love and legacy. I knew that eventually, someday, I would inherit it, and I would fill it with my own memories, my own laughter, my own love. It was a future I looked forward to, a promise I held close to my heart. She had the foresight, bless her heart, to include a clause in her will, a specific provision that protected my right to that future. I was to have the first right of refusal, meaning that if my parents ever decided to sell the house, they were legally obligated to offer it to me first, at a fair market price. It was a simple, straightforward clause, designed to ensure that the house remained in the family, and that my grandmother's wishes were honored. But my parents, in their infinite wisdom, chose to ignore it. They chose to disregard the legal document, to disregard the promise they had made to Grandma, and to disregard my own feelings, my own hopes, my own dreams. They didn't. They didn't even have the decency to tell me about it beforehand, to give me a chance to make an offer, to honor the terms of the will. They simply sold the house behind my back, like I was some kind of inconvenient obstacle to their financial gain. It was a slap in the face, a betrayal that cut deeper than words can express. It ruined everything. And for that, I would never be able to forgive them. I found out about the sale in the most casual, offhand way, a throwaway comment dropped into the middle of an otherwise pleasant family dinner. It was a Sunday evening, and I had driven over to my parents' house for what I thought would be a typical, unremarkable meal of pot roast and mashed potatoes. We were sitting around the dining room table, chatting about work, about the weather, about the usual mundane details of daily life, when my mom casually mentioned, as if she were commenting on the price of gas or the latest celebrity gossip, "Oh, by the way, we sold the house in Connecticut." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs and leaving me gasping for breath. My jaw dropped, my fork clattering against my plate, the sound echoing in the sudden, deafening silence. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut, a sharp, unexpected pain that left me reeling. The room seemed to spin, the faces of my parents blurring into a distorted, unrecognizable mess. "Sold?" I managed to stammer, my voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean sold?" "You sold Grandma's house." My parents exchanged a nervous glance, a silent communication that spoke volumes. It was clear that they had been dreading this moment, that they had been hoping to break the news gently, to sugarcoat the bitter pill. "Well, yes, honey," my mom said, her voice overly cheerful, a clear indication that she was trying to deflect. "We thought you knew. We sold it a few weeks ago." "A few weeks ago?" They had known for weeks, and they hadn't bothered to tell me? The betrayal was staggering. "Without telling me?" I demanded, my voice rising in pitch, the carefully constructed facade of politeness crumbling under the weight of my anger. "Without giving me a chance to buy it, as Grandma's will clearly stipulated?" My dad, usually the more diplomatic of the two, cleared his throat and jumped in to defend. "Now, Allison, let's not get hysterical," he said, his voice laced with a condescending tone that always grated on my nerves. It was a business decision, pure and simple. The upkeep was too much, the property taxes were astronomical, and frankly, we just couldn't afford to keep it anymore. "That's bull and you know it," I snapped, my voice shaking with rage. "Grandma left you plenty of money to cover the expenses. You don't need the money from the sale." They stammered and made excuses, claiming it was a difficult decision, that they had agonized over it for months, that they had explored every other option before finally deciding to sell. They even tried to argue that they hadn't realized the clause in the will was still valid, that it was an old document, and they had simply forgotten about it. Lies. All lies. I could see it in their eyes, in their forced smiles, in their carefully rehearsed justifications. They were deliberately twisting the truth, trying to manipulate me into accepting their selfish actions. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they didn't care about the pain they were causing me. "You're lying," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You knew about the clause. You deliberately ignored it." My mom's face flushed red with anger. "Don't you dare accuse us of lying, Allison," she said, her voice sharp. "We did what we thought was best. We made a responsible decision, and you need to accept it." I stood up from the table, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound echoing in the tense silence. "This isn't about what's best for you," I said, my voice trembling with rage. "This is about Grandma's wishes, about her legacy, about the promise you made to her, and about the disrespect you've shown for both her and me." I turned and walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me, leaving my parents to stew in their own guilt and deceit. As I drove home, tears streaming down my face, I knew that things would never be the same. My parents had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and the trust that I had placed in them had been shattered beyond repair. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about betrayal, about family legacy, and about the deep-seated resentments that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. And there was no telling where this hurt would leave our family. I knew I had to find a lawyer. The legal battle was a long and grueling ordeal, a constant source of stress and frustration that consumed my every waking moment. It felt like I was locked in a David and Goliath struggle, fighting against the combined forces of my parents' stubbornness, their financial resources, and their unwavering belief that they were in the right. The stress consumed me, and I could barely sleep at night. It felt like I was losing grip on what it meant to be myself. I hired a lawyer, a force of nature named Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson was a bulldog of a woman with a sharp mind, a fiery spirit, and a reputation for winning even the most difficult cases. She was exactly what I needed. Someone who was willing to fight for my rights, to challenge my parents' actions, and to hold them accountable for their betrayal. Mrs. Henderson filed a lawsuit, demanding that the sale be overturned and that I be given the opportunity to purchase the house at a fair market price, as stipulated in my grandmother's will. The lawsuit was a declaration of war, A clear message to my parents that I wasn't going to back down, that I was prepared to fight for what was rightfully mine. My parents, in their stubbornness and self-righteousness, dug in their heels, refusing to admit they'd done anything wrong. They hired their own lawyer, a slick, well-groomed man named Mr. Davenport, who specialized in real estate law and who seemed to take great pleasure in trying to intimidate me. They claimed they hadn't understood the clause in the will, that it was old, complicated, and that I wouldn't want to live there anyway. They argued that they had the right to sell the house, that it was their property to do with as they pleased, and that I was being unreasonable and demanding. The legal proceedings were a nightmare. There were countless meetings with lawyers, depositions, interrogatories, and mountains of paperwork. I spent hours poring over legal documents, trying to understand the complex legal jargon and strategizing with Mrs. Henderson about how to best present our case. The whole thing made me nauseous. The emotional toll was immense. I felt like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next phone call from Mrs. Henderson, dreading the next confrontation with my parents. I found it difficult to concentrate on my work, to sleep at night, to even enjoy the simple pleasures of life. The legal battle had become all-consuming, threatening to destroy me from the inside out. I was enraged. They were deliberately twisting the truth, ignoring Grandma's wishes, and trying to justify their selfish actions. They were trying to make me feel guilty for wanting what was rightfully mine, for wanting to honor my grandmother's memory. What was wrong with them? As the legal proceedings dragged on, I started to feel like I was losing my parents. They were no longer the loving, supportive figures I had always known. They had become cold, distant, and adversarial, treating me like an enemy rather than a daughter. I grieved for the loss of the relationship we had once shared, for the trust that had been shattered, and for the future that had been stolen from me. This was about so much more than the house. It was about betrayal, about family legacy, and about the disrespect they showed for both my grandmother and me. I was determined to fight for what was right, even if it meant sacrificing my relationship with my parents. As the legal proceedings dragged on, casting a long, dark shadow over my life, I began to uncover a disturbing pattern of behavior on my parents' part, a series of calculated moves designed to deliberately circumvent my grandmother's will and ensure that I would never have a chance to purchase the house. It was as if they weren't just negligent or misguided, they were actively, consciously, working against me. And that hurt even more than the loss of the house. It turns out my parents didn't just ignore the clause, they actively went to great lengths to manipulate the situation in their favor. The first clue came from Mrs. Henderson, who had subpoenaed the appraisal documents for the house. The appraisal had been conducted just weeks before the sale, and the appraised value was shockingly low, significantly below the market value of comparable properties in the area. "This is fishy, Allison," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice grim. "This appraisal is way off. It looks like someone deliberately undervalued the property." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Could it be true? Had my parents deliberately manipulated the appraisal to make the house unaffordable for me? I confronted them with the information, but they vehemently denied any wrongdoing, claiming that the appraisal was accurate and objective and that I was grasping at straws. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't convinced. She hired her own independent appraiser, who came back with a much higher valuation, confirming our suspicions that the original appraisal had been deliberately suppressed. The new valuation was significantly higher, and it was enough to prove that my parents were not acting in good faith. We had our second win in the books. Then, we discovered something even more disturbing. My parents had refused to disclose the buyer's identity, claiming that it was confidential information and that they were bound by a non-disclosure agreement. But Mrs. Henderson, through some clever legal maneuvering, managed to uncover the buyer's name, a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, with no readily identifiable ownership. I felt sick. I confronted my parents again, demanding to know who the real buyer was and why they were being so secretive. This time, they became even more evasive, claiming that they didn't know the real buyer and that they had simply dealt with a representative. It was obvious that they were lying, but they refused to budge. Finally, we learned that my parents had even tried to pressure my lawyer, Mrs. Henderson, into dropping the case. They had contacted her directly, offering her a generous settlement if she would convince me to abandon the lawsuit. Mrs. Henderson, of course, had refused, But the fact that my parents had even attempted to bribe her was a clear indication of their desperation and their willingness to do anything to get their way. My parents had become villains in a movie that I didn't want to watch. Their actions were not just negligent, they were malicious. They were so obsessed with what they wanted, with their own financial gain, that they were willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate to get it, regardless of the cost to me or to the memory of my grandmother. The worst part was that they were now sending threatening calls to Sarah, warning me of the danger I was in by trying to reveal their secrets. It was hard to believe these were the parents I had once loved. As I uncovered these details, piece by piece, my perception of my parents began to unravel. They were no longer the loving, supportive figures I had always known. They had become something else entirely, calculating, deceitful, and utterly ruthless. I began to wonder, how well did I actually know my parents? Had they always been this way, or had something changed them? It was a chilling thought. The weight of their betrayal pressed down on me, suffocating me with despair. It felt like I was drowning in a sea of lies and deceit, with no hope of rescue. I was fighting for the house, yes, but I was also fighting for something more, for the truth, for justice, and for the memory of my grandmother. And I was not willing to give up, no matter what the cost. The court hearing arrived like a grim specter, casting a long, chilling shadow over my already fractured life. It was a day I had simultaneously dreaded and yearned for, a day that would finally determine the fate of my grandmother's house and, in many ways, the fate of my family. The weight of it all threatened to crush me. The courtroom was a sterile, intimidating space, filled with the hushed whispers of lawyers, the rustling of legal documents, and the oppressive weight of legal authority. I sat beside Mrs. Henderson, my hands trembling slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. Across the room, my parents sat with Mr. Davenport, their faces etched with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. They avoided my gaze, refusing to acknowledge my presence. This was officially the end of everything. The hearing was a blur of legal jargon and emotional testimony. Mr. Davenport presented his case. My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and write a comment, and we begin. My parents, bless their cotton-picking souls, had always had let's call it a peculiar way of showing their love. Picture one of those Norman Rockwell paintings, but with a generous dollop of passive-aggressive sprinkles. Growing up, it was a constant barrage of thinly veiled comparisons. Sarah, darling, why can't you be more like Brittany? She always looks so put together, so effortlessly graceful. Or, honestly, Sarah, Brittany has her finances under control like a seasoned CFO. When are you going to start thinking about retirement? Ethan, my older brother, was the sun in their carefully curated universe. Everything he touched turned to gold, or at least, that's how they saw it. If he got a B+ on a test, it was because the teacher was biased. If he crashed the car, it was the other driver's fault. He was their precious, their perfect Ethan. And Brittany, well, she just amplified it. She was perfect on paper. Picture a Barbie doll who'd somehow aced a business degree and had a knack for saying exactly what people wanted to hear. Blonde hair that always looked freshly blown out, an unnervingly cheerful disposition, and a wardrobe that could bankrupt a small nation. So imagine my surprise and, frankly, my simmering years in the making resentment when my parents summoned me over for a family meeting. As soon as I walked through their perfectly manicured front yard and saw Ethan's BMW parked next to Brittany's pristine white SUV, I knew this wasn't going to be a casual Sunday lunch. This was going to be a disaster wrapped in a pastel-colored bow. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, immediately assaulted by the scent of potpourri and freshly baked cookies, a deceptive facade of domestic bliss. Ethan and Brittany were already seated in the living room, perched on the edge of the plush sofa, looking sickeningly smug. Brittany offered me one of her usual saccharine smiles, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. Ethan simply nodded, his expression a mixture of condescension and pity. I wanted to roll my eyes, but I knew better than to provoke them before I even knew what was going on. Sarah, darling, Mom started, her voice dripping with that faux sweetness she reserved for awkward situations, the kind where she knew she was about to deliver some devastating news. We have a wonderful opportunity for you. Those words were like a starting pistol for my anxiety. Opportunity in my family's vocabulary usually translated to inconvenience for Sarah, massive benefit for Ethan. I gripped my purse a little tighter. Dad cleared his throat, joining the performance. Ethan and Brittany are having a bit of a challenge getting into the housing market, dear. He said this like they were facing some insurmountable obstacle, like climbing Mount Everest barefoot. My heart sank into my slightly worn but comfortable shoes. Okay, I replied cautiously, trying to decipher their carefully chosen words. What could this possibly have to do with me? Mom exchanged a meaningful glance with Dad, then turned back to me, her eyes gleaming with a strange mixture of guilt and excitement. So, we've decided to gift them your house. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. The kind of silence that made the buzzing of the fluorescent lights sound deafening. My house. My house. The one I'd scrimped and saved for. The one I'd poured $75,000 of my hard-earned money into over the last few years. Fixing it up, painting the walls in colors I chose, making it mine. The first real investment I'd ever made in myself. My house. I finally managed to choke out, the words barely audible above the pounding of my heart. Brittany gave me that saccharine smile again, this time with an added layer of patronizing sympathy. It's really for the best, Sarah. We need it so much more than you do, honey. We're trying to start a family, and it's just so unfair the way the economy is at the moment. You know. Ethan nodded in agreement, his expression carefully calibrated to convey just the right amount of concern and gratitude. Plus, the neighborhood has such good schools. We have to think about our future children. You'll land on your feet. But we are forever grateful. Brittany added, like I should be thanking them for robbing me. But where am I supposed to live? I asked, the words barely a whisper. I felt numb, like I'd been hit by a truck. All the years of saving and hard work had been erased in a single, casual sentence. Mom patted my hand, her diamond rings sparkling under the chandelier. Oh, don't you worry your pretty little head. We're offering you the cabin. It's perfectly charming, and it's much more manageable for a single girl like yourself. The cabin. My parents' dilapidated, bug-infested cabin in the middle of nowhere, a place that hadn't been updated since the Carter administration. A place where cell service went to die, and the only neighbors were bears, squirrels, and the occasional gun-toting recluse. A place that smelled perpetually of damp wood and regret. This was their wonderful opportunity? This was their grand solution? I almost laughed. Almost. But instead, I just nodded, my throat tight with unshed tears. I knew arguing was pointless. They'd already made up their minds. And frankly, I just wanted to get out of there, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of their warped reality. Thank you, I mumbled, rising to my feet. I appreciate the offer. I barely made it to my car before the tears started to fall. As I drove away, I could see Ethan and Brittany through the living room window, raising their glasses in a toast. They looked like royalty, celebrating their victory. And I felt like a peasant, banished to the wilderness, stripped of everything I'd worked for. And I couldn't stop thinking there had to be something more to this. There was no reason to give my house away, not without some incentive. The move was every bit as soul-crushing as I'd anticipated. It was like watching my life get packed into cardboard boxes, each one a painful reminder of my misplaced trust and my parents' blatant favoritism. Ethan and Brittany, predictably, were practically giddy, flitting around my house, already discussing paint colors and granite countertops. Brittany had even pinned a dream kitchen inspiration board to the fridge, featuring photos of kitchens that probably cost more than my entire net worth. I tried to maintain a semblance of composure, forcing a tight smile whenever they asked helpful questions like, "Are you sure you don't want to leave us that rug? It'll totally clash with our aesthetic," or "Do you think we should knock down this wall to make a breakfast nook?" I wanted to scream, to rip the inspiration board to shreds and remind them that this was my home, the one I'd painstakingly chosen and lovingly restored. But I bit my tongue, knowing it would only fuel their self-satisfied glee. The cabin, when I finally arrived, was exactly as horrific as I remembered. Maybe even worse. It was a squat, lopsided structure swallowed by the encroaching forest, its paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood, mold, and something vaguely reminiscent of dead squirrels. Cobwebs, the size of my hand, draped across every corner, and dust motes danced in the faint sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. It was the kind of place that horror movies used as a setting, a place where bad things happened. The plumbing was a symphony of gurgling and groaning, threatening to erupt in a geyser of rusty water at any moment. The only heating source was a rickety old wood stove that looked like it had been salvaged from a shipwreck. I stared at it with a mixture of apprehension and dread. I hadn't chopped wood since summer camp, and I was pretty sure I was more likely to chop off a limb than start a fire. But I was determined to make the best of it, to prove to myself, and maybe secretly to my parents, that I could survive this. I spent the first few days scrubbing, cleaning, and airing out the cabin, battling against the ingrained grime and the persistent smell of decay. I felt like I was fighting a losing battle, but I refused to give up. Miraculously, I managed to get the internet hooked up, a minor victory in the face of overwhelming adversity. At least I could stream some Netflix and pretend I wasn't completely isolated in the middle of nowhere. As I started to settle in, a nagging sense of unease began to creep in. It started with small, seemingly insignificant things. A loose floorboard under the old, threadbare rug in the living room, one that creaked ominously whenever I stepped on it. A strange scratching sound in the walls at night, like tiny claws scrabbling for purchase. I initially dismissed them as the quirks of an old house, the sounds of nature reclaiming its territory. But then there were the other things, the things that couldn't be so easily explained away. One morning, I found a muddy footprint on the porch, even though it hadn't rained in days. It was a large footprint, too big to be a squirrel or a raccoon. Another time, while hanging laundry on the line, I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the woods, a fleeting glimpse of something dark and shadowy darting between the trees. I told myself it was just my imagination, fueled by cabin fever and a healthy dose of paranoia. And then there was the smell. A faint, metallic odor that seemed to come and go, clinging to the air like a ghost. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was always there, lurking beneath the musty scent of the cabin. It made my stomach churn and my skin crawl. I tried to ignore it all, to rationalize it, to convince myself that I was simply being overly sensitive, that the isolation was getting to me. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing day, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a sense of being constantly scrutinized by unseen eyes. It was as if the cabin itself was alive, and it was watching me, waiting for something. I started locking all the doors and windows at night, even though it was probably pointless. If something wanted to get in, it would find a way. I would turn off the lights earlier than usual. The idea of being watched was terrifying. I tried to talk to my parents about it, to voice my growing unease and the inexplicable things I was experiencing at the cabin. But predictably, they dismissed my concerns with a wave of their manicured hands. "It's just the woods, Sarah. You're being dramatic," Mom said, rolling her eyes as if I was some hysterical teenager exaggerating a minor inconvenience. "Honestly, dear, you need to get out more and meet some people. You're letting your imagination run wild." Dad just patted my hand and mumbled something about fresh air being good for my constitution. Ethan and Brittany, of course, were too engrossed in planning their lavish housewarming party to even acknowledge my existence. They were hosting a rustic chic-themed soiree, complete with a live band, a gourmet food truck, and a signature cocktail named after themselves, the Ethan and Brittany Bliss. It was sickeningly ironic, considering the bliss was built on my misery. Frustrated, dismissed, and increasingly unnerved, I realized I was on my own. If I wanted to understand what was happening at the cabin, I had to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't rely on my parents, who were too blinded by their love for Ethan and Brittany to see anything clearly. I started researching the history of the cabin, determined to find some logical explanation for the strange occurrences. I spent hours poring over old county records, squinting at faded documents and handwritten deeds. I visited the local library, a small, unassuming building that smelled of old paper and forgotten stories, and spent days sifting through microfiche archives and dusty local history books. The librarian, a kind old woman with a penchant for gossip, seemed intrigued by my inquiry, but offered little more than vague anecdotes about the area's colorful past. It was a tedious process, filled with dead ends and false leads. But I was persistent, driven by a gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. And then, after weeks of relentless searching, I found it. An old newspaper article, tucked away in a forgotten file in the library's basement. It was a small, yellowed clipping, barely legible, but the headline caught my eye: "Local man vanishes without a trace." My heart started to pound in my chest. This was it, I knew it. The article told the story of a family who had lived in the cabin in the 1950s. A husband, a wife, and a young daughter. They were described as a quiet, unassuming family who kept to themselves. The article reported that the husband, a man named Thomas Ashton, had disappeared without a trace one day. He had gone for a walk in the woods and never returned. The police had conducted an extensive search, but found no sign of him. The case went cold and eventually was relegated to the unsolved mysteries file. The article stated the wife, Sarah Ashton, was the primary suspect, but could not be charged for the crime, as there was no evidence of foul play. My blood ran cold. I read on, my hands trembling as I deciphered the faded print. The wife, Sarah, had remarried a few years later and eventually sold the cabin. It had passed through several owners since then, each staying only a short time before selling again. The whispers of Sarah's potential crime were still talked about. The article ended with a chilling quote from a neighbor, a farmer who lived down the road. "That place has a darkness about it," he said. "I wouldn't live there if you paid me. There's something unsettling about that cabin. It feels like it's holding onto a secret." I closed the newspaper, my mind reeling. It was just a story, an old, unsolved mystery. But it resonated with me, with the strange occurrences I'd been experiencing, with the pervasive sense of unease that had settled over the cabin. The scratching noises, the muddy footprints, the metallic smell, it all seemed to fit together, like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The logical part of my brain tried to dismiss it as coincidence, as an overactive imagination fueled by isolation and a spooky old newspaper article. But the primal part of me knew that something was wrong, that the cabin was more than just a dilapidated old building. It was a place haunted by the past, a place where something terrible had happened. And now, it felt like that something was reaching out to me, trying to tell me its story. As I turned off the computer and left the library, I was terrified. Armed with the chilling details of the Ashton case, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a real-life ghost story. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and whispers in the dark. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the trees sent shivers down my spine. I knew I had to find something concrete, something tangible to either confirm or debunk my growing fears. I couldn't live like this, suspended in a state of constant dread. I decided to explore the cabin more thoroughly, to search every nook and cranny for any sign of what might have happened to Thomas Ashton. I started with the obvious places. I ripped up the loose floorboard under the rug in the living room, expecting to find a hidden stash of money or perhaps a dusty old diary. But all I found was dirt, dust, and the skeletal remains of a long-deceased mouse. Disappointment washed over me, quickly replaced by a renewed determination. I meticulously searched the walls for any sign of the scratching sound, tapping on every panel, listening for hollow spots. I crawled into the cramped attic, choking on dust and cobwebs, but found nothing but old boxes filled with forgotten junk. I even ventured down into the dark, damp cellar, armed with a flashlight and a hefty dose of courage, but the only things I found were spiders, mildew, and the lingering smell of decay. Days turned into nights as my obsession grew. I became consumed by the search, neglecting my work, my friends, and my basic hygiene. I was a woman possessed, driven by a desperate need to uncover the truth. Then, one afternoon, while I was cleaning out the old wood stove in the kitchen, I noticed something strange. I had been shoveling out the accumulated ashes, my mind preoccupied with the Ashton case, when my shovel scraped against something hard. It was a small metal plate, hidden behind a thick layer of soot and grime. It was flush with the wall, easy to miss. I pried at it with a screwdriver, my heart pounding in my chest. The metal was old and corroded, but it eventually gave way, revealing a narrow opening in the brickwork. It was too small to be a ventilation shaft, too hidden to be anything accidental. This had to be deliberate. Inside the opening, I found a small, tarnished metal box. It was about the size of a shoebox, and it was heavy, surprisingly so. My hands trembled as I lifted it out, the metal cold against my skin. A wave of dizziness swept over me, and I had to lean against the wall for support. This was it, I thought. This was the key. With shaking fingers, I carefully opened the box. The hinges creaked in protest, releasing a musty odor that sent a shiver down my spine. Inside the box was a collection of items. A faded photograph of a young woman with haunted eyes, her face etched with sadness and despair. It was Sarah Ashton, the wife who had been suspected of murdering her husband. A tarnished wedding ring, its gold dulled by time and neglect. It was engraved with the initials TA and SA and a small folded piece of paper, its edges frayed and yellowed. I unfolded the paper carefully, my breath held captive in my chest. On it, written in a shaky hand, was a single word, help. And written below that in smaller, even more shaky script, was a string of numbers. Latitude and longitude coordinates. I stared at the coordinates, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. A desperate plea for help, hidden away for decades. A secret message, waiting to be discovered. This wasn't just a ghost story anymore. This was something real, something tangible, something that demanded to be investigated. A rush of adrenaline surged through me, washing away the fear and replacing it with a burning sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. This was the beginning of a new chapter, the chapter where justice was served. My mind raced, the coordinates burning in my memory. They were close, I knew it. I immediately grabbed my phone and punched the numbers into a GPS app. The location popped up, a wooded area about 10 miles from the cabin, marked as unverified landmark. My heart pounded. It had to be something significant, something the locals hadn't bothered to map or record. I grabbed my keys, a flashlight, and the tarnished metal box, and practically sprinted out of the cabin. The drive was agonizingly slow, the dirt roads bumpy and treacherous. Every shadow seemed to hold a menacing figure. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump. But the burning desire to uncover the truth kept me going. I parked my car on the side of a rarely used road and started hiking into the dense forest, following the GPS signal on my phone. The woods were eerily silent, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting long, eerie shadows that danced around me like specters. As I continued through the dense woodland, I stumbled into an overgrown field. After what felt like an eternity, I found it. A decrepit, half-collapsed stone well, almost completely hidden by the undergrowth. It was as if the forest itself was trying to conceal it, to bury it forever. An overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. This was it. This was where Thomas Ashton's story ended. I approached the well cautiously, peering over the crumbling stone lip. The well was dry, long abandoned. But something glinted at the bottom. I knew it was there, and a dark fear took over me. I knew I had to get down there. I took a deep breath and checked the sides of the wall. Thankfully, it was not too deep, and with some steady movements, I started to climb down the inside of the well. The air grew colder and damper as I descended. I reached the bottom, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And then I saw it. Not a body. Not bones. Not anything overtly gruesome as I had imagined. Instead, neatly tucked against the far wall, was a weathered leather suitcase, the kind someone might take on a long train journey. Relief, disbelief, and a surge of adrenaline flooded through me. If there was no body, then what was this? Carefully, I maneuvered myself, grabbing the suitcase, and began the arduous climb back to the surface, my muscles screaming in protest. Back at the cabin, under the harsh glare of the kitchen light, I finally opened the suitcase. It was filled with documents, bank statements, legal papers, deeds, and letters, all meticulously organized, and all dated from the 1950s. As I sifted through the papers, a shocking story began to unfold. Thomas Ashton wasn't a victim of foul play. He was a crook. A fraudster. He had been embezzling money from his employer, a local bank. He had stashed the stolen funds in a series of secret accounts, planning to disappear and start a new life. Sarah Ashton knew about his plans. She knew about the stolen money. But she also knew that he intended to leave her and their daughter behind, penniless. The letters revealed a desperate plea from Sarah to Thomas, begging him to reconsider, to share the money, to not abandon them. But Thomas was unmoved. His only concern was his own freedom and fortune. Sarah had confronted him on the night he was supposed to leave, and in a moment of rage and despair, she pushed him, causing him to strike his head and die. She hadn't planned to kill him, but in a panic, she had hidden his body at the bottom of the well. The suitcase contained all the evidence to prove Thomas's crimes, as well as Sarah's confession. But there was more to this than the events of the past. Some of the more recent documentation related to Ethan and Brittany. It turns out that Ethan's struggles were a complete fabrication. Brittany had discovered the existence of Thomas Ashton's secret accounts, hidden away in a Swiss bank. She had persuaded Ethan to concoct a sob story about financial hardship, knowing that my parents would be eager to help, especially if it meant dispossessing me of my house. Their plan was to use my house as collateral to secure a loan, then use that money to access the hidden fortune. They intended to leave the country and start a new life, leaving me and my parents in the dust. I was furious. Everything was so meticulously planned, so calculatedly cruel. Armed with the evidence of Thomas Ashton's embezzlement and Ethan and Brittany's despicable scheme, I drove straight to my parents' house. I dumped the suitcase on the kitchen table, spreading out the documents before their shocked eyes. "Do you see now?" I shouted, my voice trembling with anger and hurt. "This is who you've been favoring. This is who you think is so much better than me. They were manipulating you, using you, and they were going to leave you with nothing." My parents were speechless, their faces pale with disbelief and shame. They had been so blinded by their favoritism that they couldn't see the truth, even when it was staring them in the face. I immediately contacted the authorities, providing them with all the evidence I had gathered. The investigation was swift and decisive. The police exhumed Thomas Ashton's remains from the well, confirming Sarah Ashton's long-hidden confession. Ethan and Brittany's scheme unraveled quickly. They were arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. The bank seized their assets, including my house. A few weeks later, Ethan and Brittany were living in a small apartment across town, their dreams of wealth and luxury shattered. My parents were heartbroken, their reputation tarnished. As for me, I moved back into my house, its walls no longer whispering with secrets and sadness. The darkness had been lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and closure. I have not spoken to them since, and I am better off for it. I sold the cabin and took myself on a long vacation. The truth was finally out. And while the experience had been terrifying and traumatic, it had also made me stronger, more resilient, and more determined to live my life on my own terms. I had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, a warrior who had finally found her voice. And most importantly, I finally understood that my worth wasn't defined by my parents' approval, but by my own strength and resilience. I was free. My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and write a comment, and we begin. Part 1. The Empty Seats. My wedding day. I'd dreamt about it since I was a little girl, flipping through bridal magazines and sketching my ideal dress in the margins of my notebooks. I'd always envisioned a small, intimate affair. No sprawling castle, no hundreds of guests I barely knew. Just a heartfelt celebration of love with the people who truly mattered to me, the ones who had been there through thick and thin. I'd found that in Mark. He wasn't flashy or extravagant, but he was kind, funny, and fiercely loyal. He saw me, really saw me, in a way that no one else ever had. And on this day, our wedding day, I wanted to share that love, that connection, with everyone we held dear. We'd chosen a beautiful outdoor venue nestled in the rolling hills outside of town, a sprawling meadow dotted with wildflowers, framed by towering oak trees. I pictured exchanging vows under a delicate canopy of twinkling fairy lights, the soft, ethereal glow illuminating the joyous smiles of our friends and family. We had spent months meticulously planning every detail, poring over Pinterest boards, agonizing over the perfect shade of blush for the roses, the playlist that captured our relationship, the locally sourced menu that reflected our values. I wanted everything to be perfect, not for show, but because this was our moment, a reflection of our love story. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that felt blessed by the heavens. I woke up feeling a mix of excitement and nerves, a fluttering in my stomach that refused to be quelled. My bridesmaids arrived, buzzing with energy, and the getting ready process began. Hair, makeup, champagne toasts, and endless chatter filled the air, a welcome distraction from the anxieties swirling within me. As I slipped into my dress, a simple, elegant gown of ivory lace, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. This was it. This was the day I would officially become Mrs. Sarah Miller. I looked in the mirror, and for the first time that day, I saw a bride looking back. Confident, beautiful, happy. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 3 p.m. As I stood backstage, waiting for my cue to walk down the aisle, I took a deep breath and closed my eyes, trying to savor the moment. I could hear the soft murmur of the guests as they found their seats, the gentle strumming of the acoustic guitar, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then the music started. A soft, melodic tune that Mark and I had chosen together. It was my cue. With a smile on my face, I began to walk, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the end of the aisle and saw Mark standing at the altar, his eyes filled with love and admiration, I felt a surge of joy so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. But then my gaze drifted to the front row, and the smile froze on my face. 2 seats, right next to each other, remained conspicuously empty. My parents' seats. A wave of icy dread washed over me, stealing the joy from the moment. I tried to tell myself there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. Maybe their flight had been delayed. Maybe they'd gotten lost on the way to the venue. Maybe something had come up at the last minute. I desperately clung to these possibilities, refusing to let the panic take hold. But deep down, a cold, hard knot of dread was forming in my stomach. I knew my parents. They were always punctual, always organized, always meticulously planned. And they knew how much this day meant to me. I'd been explicit about how much their support and presence meant to me. The ceremony went by in a blur. I recited my vows, my voice wavering slightly. I exchanged rings with Mark, my fingers trembling. I tried to focus on the joy of the moment, to block out the nagging feeling of unease. But the absence of my parents hung over me like a dark cloud, casting a long, ominous shadow over what should have been the happiest day of my life. Every word, every song, every moment was tainted by their missing presence. After the ceremony, as the guests mingled and congratulated us, offering their well wishes and compliments, I felt like I was going through the motions, a robot programmed to smile and nod and say thank you. But inside, I was screaming. I excused myself from the crowd, feigning a sudden need to freshen up, and rushed to a quiet corner. I pulled out my phone and dialed my parents' cell phones, one after the other. Each call went straight to voicemail. Mom? Dad? It's me, Sarah. Where are you? What's going on? The ceremony's over. Everyone's here. Please call me back. I'm so worried. My voice cracked with emotion. Hours passed and still no word. The reception started, and I forced myself to smile, to dance with Mark, to make small talk with the guests. But inside, I was crumbling, piece by piece. My parents were supposed to be here, celebrating with me, sharing in my happiness. They were supposed to walk me down the aisle, give a heartfelt toast, and dance with me to our special song. But they were nowhere to be found, their empty seats a constant, painful reminder of their absence. I spent most of the night looking anxiously at the entrance, hoping they would just come and I could just have my day. But as the hours flew by and the dance floor began to clear out, I knew it was a useless venture. As the reception drew to a close, I stood there, a bride on her wedding day, surrounded by well-wishers, but feeling utterly alone. The fairy lights flickered and dimmed, casting long shadows across the meadow. And I knew, with a sinking heart, that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Part 2: The phone call. The honeymoon suite felt more like a prison cell. I couldn't shake the image of those empty seats, replaying the ceremony over and over in my head, each time amplifying the pain. Mark tried his best to comfort me, holding me close, whispering soothing words, but I was inconsolable. The joy of our wedding day had been irrevocably tainted, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and a deep sense of betrayal. Sleep was elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces, their expressions blank, unreadable. I imagined every possible scenario, from a tragic accident to a sudden illness, each one more horrifying than the last. I kept checking my phone, willing it to ring, desperate for some kind of explanation. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, mirroring my mood. The beautiful ocean view from our balcony offered no solace. I felt drained, empty, like a shell of my former self. Mark brought me coffee and breakfast in bed, but I could barely eat a bite. The knot in my stomach had tightened, making it impossible to swallow. Finally, around noon, after what felt like an eternity, my phone rang. I lunged for it, my heart leaping into my throat. The caller ID displayed Mom's cell. I hesitated for a moment, bracing myself for the worst, then answered the call, my voice trembling. "Mom? Where are you? What happened? Are you okay?" I blurted out, the words tumbling over each other in my desperate attempt to get some answers. There was a long pause, a pregnant silence that stretched on for what felt like an eternity. And then, the sound that I least expected, the sound that shattered the last vestiges of hope. My mother started to laugh. It wasn't a warm, loving laugh, the kind that I associated with happy memories. It was a cold, brittle laugh, a harsh, mocking sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was the kind of laugh you hear in movies from villainous characters when they reveal that they have betrayed you. "Oh, Sarah, darling," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, laced with a tone that was almost cruel. "You really thought we'd be there? After everything we've told you?" I was stunned, paralyzed by disbelief. "What? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" I stammered, struggling to make sense of her words. The floor suddenly seemed to move beneath my feet. "Well, dear, your father and I decided we had much better things to do with our time. After all, weddings are boring, and yours was sure to be the most dull of them all." She chuckled, a sound that echoed in my ears like a death knell. "We took a trip to the Bahamas. We needed a break from all the wedding planning stress. It was much more relaxing than spending the day watching you marry him." She spat out him like it was a curse. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. You missed my wedding for a vacation? For a vacation? Are you serious?" My voice rose in pitch, cracking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Oh, lighten up, Sarah," she said, her tone dismissive, as if I was overreacting to a minor inconvenience. "It's not like you're royalty or anything. It's not as if the wedding was broadcast across the world. Besides," she continued, her voice taking on a sharper edge, "we told you we didn't approve of Mark. We told you he wasn't good enough for you. But you never listen to us, do you? You always have to do things your own way. So, we decided to avoid the whole thing altogether. It was much easier that way." The words hit me like a slap in the face. My parents, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had deliberately missed my wedding. Not because of an emergency, not because of unforeseen circumstances, but because they disapproved of my choice of husband and found a tropical vacation more appealing. My anger started to boil, a searing, white-hot rage that threatened to consume me. How could you do this to me? How could you be so cruel? This was the most important day of my life. You were supposed to be there for me. You were supposed to support me. My voice was shaking with fury, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You always were prone to histrionics, just like your mother. You'll get over it. Besides," she added, her tone softening slightly, but only to deliver an even more devastating blow. "We left you a check. It's in the mail. Consider it a wedding gift. A small token to make up for our absence." She paused, then added with a chilling finality, "Try not to spend it all in one place, dear. You'll need it when that marriage of yours inevitably falls apart." And with that, she hung up, leaving me reeling, gasping for air, the phone slipping from my numb fingers. I was left standing in the middle of the room, alone with my broken heart, the sound of my mother's laughter echoing in my ears, a constant reminder of their callous disregard for my happiness. My parents had destroyed me, and they didn't even care. Part 3. The Inheritance. The check arrived 2 days later, a crisp, impersonal piece of paper tucked inside a generic Hallmark card. It was for $10,000, a sum that would have once seemed significant, but now felt like a paltry consolation prize, a feeble attempt to buy my silence. I stared at it, my hands trembling, a bitter taste rising in my throat. It was a band-aid on a gaping wound, a hollow gesture that did nothing to mend the broken bonds between me and my parents. I tore the check into tiny pieces, the act a small, defiant act of rebellion against their control. The money meant nothing. I would rather have their love and support, their presence at my wedding, than all the riches in the world. A week later, a thick, legal-sized envelope arrived in the mail, postmarked from my parents' lawyer. It was formal and intimidating, the kind of document that spelled trouble. Inside was a letter from the lawyer, informing me of the passing of my parents' will, along with a certified copy of the document itself. I braced myself, a familiar wave of anxiety washing over me. I expected more disappointment, more rejection, perhaps a passive-aggressive note disguised as legal jargon. But what I found was even more shocking, more devastating than anything I could have imagined. I sat down at the kitchen table, took a deep breath, and began to read the will, my heart pounding in my chest. The language was dense and convoluted, filled with legal terminology that made my head spin. But the gist of it was clear. Upon their death, my parents' entire estate, a substantial fortune amassed over decades of hard work and shrewd investments, including real estate, stocks, and other assets, would be divided equally between my brother, David, and a local animal shelter. There was a brief mention of me, a single sentence that sent a shiver of cold dread down my spine. Due to circumstances as described in the addendum, Sarah Miller will not receive any portion of the estate. An addendum. A separate document detailing the reasons for my disinheritance. My fingers trembled as I turned to the next page. There it was, in stark black and white prose, the justification for my exclusion from their wealth, a scathing indictment of my character and my choices. The will stipulated that I had demonstrated a consistent pattern of poor judgment and irresponsible behavior throughout her adult life, including but not limited to her ill-advised decision to marry Mark Miller against the express wishes and guidance of her parents. It further stated that I had repeatedly exhibited a lack of respect for their values and traditions, and that she had proven herself to be fundamentally incapable of managing her own affairs, let alone a significant inheritance. The will concluded with the devastating pronouncement that my parents believed I was unfit to manage their wealth, and that granting me any portion of their estate would be contrary to their wishes and would ultimately be detrimental to her well-being. I was completely cut out, disinherited, erased from their legacy. I reread the will, my mind reeling, searching for any loophole, any mistake, any sign that this was all some kind of cruel joke. But it was clear as day, written in precise, unambiguous language. My parents had intentionally disinherited me, not on a whim, but after careful consideration and meticulous planning. The implication was clear. They blamed me for everything. For marrying Mark, for defying their expectations, for choosing my own path in life. They saw my independence as a betrayal, my happiness as a personal affront. And they were punishing me for it, even from beyond the grave, solidifying their rejection in the most permanent, most irrevocable way possible. I felt numb, hollowed out, as if all the blood had drained from my body. First, they missed my wedding, shattering my dreams of a perfect day. Then, they laughed about it, dismissing my pain with callous indifference. Now, they were disinheriting me, cementing their disapproval in legal stone, casting me out of their family and leaving me with nothing. I felt isolated, adrift in a sea of despair, completely alone in the world. My parents, the people who were supposed to love me and support me unconditionally, had turned against me, their rejection complete and absolute. I had lost my family, my inheritance, and my sense of belonging, all in one fell swoop. The sense of injustice washed over me. This was not the last they would hear from me. Part 4. The Secret. I couldn't bear the silence. the crushing weight of unanswered questions and raw, unadulterated grief. I needed answers, even if they were painful. I needed to understand why my parents, who had always seemed to prioritize family, had turned against me so completely. I knew David, my brother, was the only person who might have some insight into what had happened, some explanation for my parents' behavior. I called him, my voice tight with a mixture of anger, hurt, and desperate curiosity, demanding a meeting. He sounded hesitant but agreed to meet me for lunch the following day. The restaurant we chose was a small, unassuming bistro in a quiet part of town, a place we had frequented as children, and a place where we had so many family memories. As I waited for him, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. This meeting was crucial. When David finally arrived, he looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room, avoiding my gaze. He had always been a sensitive, quiet soul, and I could see that he was struggling to process everything. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched with worry and a sense of burden. He avoided my stare and fidgeted with his silverware. "Look, Sarah," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "I know this is a mess. I know what happened at the wedding, I know about the will. But I didn't have anything to do with it. I swear." "Really?" I said, my voice sharp with skepticism. "You're telling me you had no idea about any of this? That you were completely blindsided?" I didn't believe him. I found it impossible that a brother and sister did not know of each other's lives. David hesitated, then sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Okay, fine. I knew. But I didn't agree with it. I tried to talk Mom and Dad out of it. I told them it wasn't fair, that it was wrong. But they wouldn't listen. They were set on this." I felt a wave of both relief and anger wash over me. Relief that he was finally being honest. Anger that he hadn't told me sooner. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you warn me? You knew how much I wanted to have my parents there, even if I knew that they didn't like Mark." David looked down at his plate, his cheeks flushing slightly. Because they made me promise not to. They made me swear I wouldn't tell you anything. They said if I did, they'd cut me out too." My breath caught in my throat. They threatened you? They used you to get to me." David nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. "They were obsessed with control, Sarah. You know that. They always had to have their way. And they hated that you were so independent, that you didn't need them anymore. They always wanted me to be the golden child. I guess I just wanted their approval." The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a disturbing picture of manipulation and control. My parents, consumed by their own insecurities and their need to maintain a tight grip on their children's lives, had orchestrated this entire situation to punish me for daring to defy them. They were punishing both of us. But why? I asked, my voice cracking with emotion. Why did they hate me so much? What did I do to deserve this? I needed to understand their motivations. What had I done so that my parents would cut me off from the will, and what did they have against Mark? David hesitated again, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. He clearly wasn't comfortable revealing what he was about to say. He glanced around the restaurant as if afraid of being overheard, then leaned closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you don't know, Sarah," he said, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and guilt. Something they never told you. Something they've kept secret your entire life." He paused, his gaze flicking nervously between me and the other diners. You're not their biological daughter, Sarah." The words hit me like a physical blow, a sudden, violent punch to the gut. The world around me seemed to tilt and spin, the familiar surroundings blurring into a kaleidoscope of colors. The ground seemed to be slipping beneath my feet. My breath hitched in my throat. I gripped the edge of the table for support, my knuckles white. The room started to close in. "What?" I gasped, my voice barely audible. "What are you talking about? That's not possible." David took a deep, shaky breath, steeling himself to deliver the final, shattering blow. "Mom and Dad couldn't have children," he said softly, his voice filled with both sadness and a strange sort of relief. "They adopted you when you were a baby. They always kept it a secret because they were afraid you'd leave them if you found out. But they never really loved you the way they loved me. I'm their blood. You were just a substitute." Your birth certificate reads Mary, but it was changed at the hospital to Sarah. You were their project, not their child. Part 5. The Truth Revealed. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, like a shroud. You're not their biological daughter, Sarah. My mind struggled to process the information, to reconcile the years of memories, the complex relationship I had with my parents, with this new earth-shattering revelation. It felt like the foundation of my identity, the very core of my being, had been ripped away, leaving me stranded in a foreign land. I stared at David, my face a mask of shock and disbelief, tears welling in my eyes. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the thumping of my heart. "That's impossible. I look like them. I have their mannerisms." But even as I said the words, I knew they rang hollow. I saw fleeting glints of their faces and could not remember them. David reached across the table, his hand covering mine. His touch was gentle, comforting, but did little to ease the pain that was searing through my soul. "I know it's a lot to take in, Sarah, but it's true. They adopted you when you were just a few weeks old. They couldn't have children of their own, and they desperately wanted a family. But they never told you because they were afraid. Afraid you'd find out, afraid you'd leave them, afraid that you would not measure up to their standards, or perhaps you would become superior." He paused, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and guilt. "But honestly, Sarah, I think they were also ashamed. Ashamed of the circumstances surrounding your adoption. They never saw you as truly their own, and they couldn't love you completely. But why didn't they ever tell me?" I sobbed, the tears streaming down my face now, blurring my vision. "Why did they keep it a secret for so long?" "They were afraid," David said softly. "And honestly, Sarah, they were ashamed. Your biological mother, she wasn't exactly someone they wanted you to know about." He hesitated, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He slid it across the table towards me. "This is your mother, Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Maggie." I picked up the photograph, my hands trembling. It was a black and white picture of a young woman, with striking green eyes and a cascade of fiery red hair. She had a mischievous grin on her face and an air of bohemian freedom about her. She looked familiar somehow, but I couldn't quite place her. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice choked with emotion. "Her name was Maggie. She was a singer, a performer in a jazz club. She was wild, vibrant, untamed. She was free," David said, a wistful look in his eyes. "She had a wild spirit, just like you." As I stared at the photograph, a memory surfaced, a long-forgotten fragment of my childhood. A memory of sneaking out of the house one night, drawn by the sounds of music and laughter, and finding myself standing outside a dimly lit bar in a seedy part of town. I remembered seeing a woman on stage, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight, singing her heart out, her voice raw and powerful. The woman in the photograph. She used to sing at the Blue Moon, right?" I whispered, my voice filled with a mixture of recognition and disbelief. David nodded, a sad smile playing on his lips. "She did. And Dad used to go there every night. He was obsessed with her. He was infatuated by her. But she didn't want him. She was too free-spirited for him. She was too busy to be with him. When she got pregnant with you, she didn't want to give you up, but she knew she couldn't take care of you on her own. She didn't want you to grow up in that world. So she made a deal with Mom and Dad. They would raise you, provide you with a stable home and a good education, but they had to promise never to tell you about her. They had to promise to erase her from your life." I stared at the photograph, tears streaming down my face, a strange mixture of grief, anger, and relief washing over me. Grief for the mother I never knew, for the life I had never lived, for the stolen identity that had shaped my entire existence. Anger at my adoptive parents for their deception, their manipulation, their inability to truly love me for who I was. Relief for finally understanding why I had never quite fit in, why I had always felt like an outsider looking in, why I had always sensed a subtle distance, a carefully guarded reserve, in my relationship with my parents. It all made sense now. The constant comparisons to others, the subtle rejections, the unspoken disapproval, the feeling of never quite measuring up to their expectations. I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love and acceptance of people who weren't even my real family, people who were incapable of giving me what I truly needed. Now, the day-to-day memories of their faces began to blur, and I wondered if I had truly loved them, or if they had merely been the mother and father I needed at the time. I had never been their own blood. They had only taken me in. I realized that I could not get through to them and decided to dedicate myself to learning the life of Maggie, my mother, and doing everything I could to become her, rather than be the ghost child they created. I decided to leave them both to their new lives and did not keep contact. As I left the restaurant that day, I felt a sense of liberation, a newfound sense of purpose. The truth was finally out, and while the pain was still raw and the wounds were still deep, I was no longer trapped in a lie. I knew who I was, or at least I knew where I came from. I resolved to find out everything I could about my mother, to learn about her life, her passions, her dreams. I wanted to understand the woman who had given me life, the woman who had entrusted me to strangers, the woman whose wild spirit lived on within me. I also realized that I needed to be strong for Mark and that I could not bring my dark past into our new life. I enrolled in singing lessons, joined a local jazz ensemble, and started to explore my own creative potential. I embraced my independence, my unconventionality, my poor decision-making, as my parents had called it. I learned to trust my instincts, to follow my heart, to live my life on my own terms, without fear of judgment or disapproval. I traveled to all the jazz clubs around town and asked around to see if anyone remembered her, and soon found some of her old friends. The wedding I once envisioned, the perfect family reunion it was supposed to be, faded into a distant memory. In its place was a new vision, a vision of a life filled with authenticity, passion, and self-acceptance. I was no longer defined by my adoptive parents' rejection, by their skewed values, by their suffocating control. I was Maggie's daughter, a free spirit, a survivor. And I was finally ready to embrace my true identity and create a future that was all my own. My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and write a comment, and we begin. Part 1. The Promised Future. Chloe, my kid sister. She was a force of nature, a walking, talking, singing hurricane of pure, unadulterated talent. Seriously, that girl had a voice that could make angels weep, or at least bring a lump to the throat of even the most jaded karaoke judge. From the moment she could string two words together, she was belting out show tunes and pop hits with a power and grace that defied her age. It wasn't just the range or the perfect pitch. It was the emotion, the raw, unfiltered passion that poured out of her with every note. I'm not just saying this because she's my sister. Chloe had that it factor, that undeniable spark that set her apart. She was born to perform, to command a stage, to captivate an audience. Her entire life revolved around music. She was in every school play, every choir, every talent show. She practiced for hours every day, honing her craft, pushing herself to be better, more expressive, more powerful. And she had a dream. A big, audacious, glittering dream. To attend the prestigious American Conservatory of Music in New York City. It was the place for aspiring vocalists, a hallowed hall where legendary singers had trained and launched their careers. It was Chloe's Mecca, the North Star guiding her every move. She'd been sketching the school name in her notebook as early as second grade. I, on the other hand, was the more grounded, practical one. I loved Chloe fiercely, and I was endlessly proud of her talent, but I knew that dreams didn't always come true. I was academic, methodical, and ambitious in a different way. While Chloe was chasing stardom, I was focused on scholarships, internships, and building a solid foundation for my future. I went to a state school with my hard work, and I was determined to make the most of the opportunity. We were a tight-knit family, and we'd always looked out for each other. Mom and Dad had instilled in us a strong sense of loyalty and mutual support. We were a team, and we faced everything together, big or small. Our family has always been there for each other, regardless of how painful the task may be. When it came to higher education, my parents, bless their hearts or not, as it turned out, always talked about our future being the most important thing. They'd saved diligently for years, stashing away money in a college fund. It wasn't a massive amount, but it was enough to make a real difference. They assured both of us time and time again that if we got accepted into our dream schools, the money would be there to help us make it happen. Chloe, despite her talent, wasn't exactly the academic type. She excelled in the arts, but she was more focused on rehearsals and auditions than on textbooks and exams. I knew she was going to be excited if things started to go well, and if my parents held their promises. I had earned a full scholarship to a state school, the plan being that the funds that my parents had saved would then go to Chloe, allowing her to pursue her dreams without the burden of crippling debt. It was a plan we had all agreed on, a plan that seemed foolproof, a plan that would give both of us the best possible start in life. The day Chloe got her acceptance letter from the conservatory, our house erupted in cheers. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and the golden sunlight streamed through the windows as Chloe ripped open the envelope, her hands trembling with anticipation. She had auditioned months ago, and the acceptance was a dream come true. I was also excited for her. When she read the words, "We are pleased to offer you admission," a wave of relief and joy washed over her face. She burst into tears, hugging the letter to her chest as if it were a winning lottery ticket. The conservatory offered her a partial scholarship, covering a portion of her tuition costs, which was enough to get her to school, but she'd still need to cover room, board, travel expenses, and living expenses in one of the most expensive cities in the world. It was a hefty sum, a daunting financial burden, but we had the college fund. Or so we thought. The excitement that ran through us would soon change. "Don't worry, sweetie," my dad said, beaming at Chloe, his eyes shining with pride. "We've got this covered. You're going to New York, and you're going to shine. We're going to make sure you have everything you need." Mom squeezed Chloe's hand, tears welling up in her eyes. "We're so proud of you, honey. This is your dream, and we're going to do everything we can to help you make it come true." She always talked about her dreams to everyone. I was thrilled for Chloe. It seemed like everything was falling into place, that all of our hard work and sacrifices had finally paid off. She was going to New York, she was going to attend her dream school, and she was going to fulfill her destiny. I could not be happier. Then came the financial aid forms, and the tuition deposit deadline, and the harsh reality check that hit us like a ton of bricks, shattering our illusions and exposing the ugly truth that lay beneath the surface. Little did Chloe and I know, this day would mark the beginning of a devastating betrayal and the unraveling of our seemingly perfect family. Part 2: The Empty Account. The initial euphoria after Chloe's acceptance slowly began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The problem was the money. Mom and Dad were being strangely evasive about it, deflecting our questions with vague assurances and dismissive comments. I started to get worried when my parents did not want to give Chloe the money that she needed to get to college. "It's all taken care of, sweetie," my mom would say, waving her hand dismissively. "Just focus on getting ready for New York. We'll handle the finances." Dad would chime in with a hearty, "Don't you worry your pretty little head about it. We're working on it. There's just some paperwork involved." They'd made excuses about paperwork, delays, and transfer fees, but their eyes wouldn't meet mine. They were always a family that communicated openly and honestly, or so I thought. This sudden secrecy, this constant deflection, was completely out of character, and it set off alarm bells in my head. I tried to reassure myself that I was being paranoid, that there was a perfectly logical explanation for their behavior. But the more they avoided the topic, the more convinced I became that something was terribly wrong. I started to press them, gently at first, then more insistently. "Mom, Dad, Chloe needs to pay the tuition deposit by next week," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and measured. "We need to know how much is in the college fund so we can figure out the payment plan." They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding my gaze. "We're working on it, honey," Dad said, his voice strained. "Just give us a little more time." "Time for what?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. "What's the problem? Why are you being so secretive?" Mom sighed, her eyes welling up with tears. It's complicated, Sarah. There's been some unforeseen circumstances." "Unforeseen circumstances?" I repeated, my heart sinking. "What does that mean?" Finally, after weeks of mounting pressure, my relentless nagging, and the looming deadline for Chloe's tuition deposit they cracked. They sat us down in the living room, their faces pale and drawn, and confessed the truth. They admitted that the college fund was gone. My world tilted on its axis. The floor fell out from beneath my feet. The air seemed to thin, making it difficult to breathe. I felt a surge of nausea rise in my throat. Gone? What do you mean gone? I demanded, my voice barely a whisper, my words laced with disbelief and horror. How can it be gone? My dad, his face ashen, stammered something about investments and a bad market. He spoke in hushed tones, his words stumbling over each other, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was saying. My mom, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen with tears, mumbled something about trying to make more money for the family and wanting to secure our future. Her voice was weak and apologetic, but her explanations felt hollow, flimsy, and utterly unconvincing. You spent it, I said, the words catching in my throat, a realization dawning on me, a chilling understanding of the depths of their betrayal. You used it for something else. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sound of Chloe's stifled sobs. They couldn't meet my gaze, their eyes filled with shame and guilt. The truth, as I was slowly beginning to understand, was far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. The bank statements, which I demanded to see, had been altered, manipulated to conceal the truth. The reality, as I pieced together from fragments of conversations and furtive glances, was that they had spent the money, not on a wise investment, not to better our lives, but on themselves. A shiny new car that Dad had been coveting for months. A lavish vacation to Europe that they had never told us about. A ridiculous renovation project on the house that they never consulted us on and that no one actually wanted. They had spent what was supposed to be Chloe's future, her dreams, her chance at a life that they had always promised her. Chloe was devastated, crushed beyond words. She had always been a dreamer, an optimist, a believer in the power of hope and hard work. But even she, with her unwavering spirit and boundless enthusiasm, understood the gravity of the situation. Her dream, the dream we'd all shared, was slipping away, vanishing like smoke in the wind. "We'll figure it out, honey," I said, forcing a smile, trying to sound optimistic, even though I felt the pit in my stomach growing larger with each passing second. "We'll find a way to make this work. We'll do whatever it takes." But deep down, I knew that the road ahead was going to be long and arduous, fraught with obstacles and setbacks. And I also knew that the trust between us and our parents had been irrevocably broken, the foundation of our family crumbling before our very eyes. The idea that my parents would stoop so low and that I had been blinded was devastating. Chloe would either get her dream, or I would have to go through with everything and see her dream happen. Part 3. The confrontation. The shock had worn off, replaced by a seething white-hot anger that consumed me from the inside out. It wasn't just the loss of the money. It was the betrayal, the deception, the sheer callousness of their actions. They hadn't just stolen Chloe's dream. They'd stolen our trust, our sense of security, the very foundation of our family. I felt like everything I had believed about them, about us, was a lie. The anger was a fire burning inside me, threatening to incinerate everything in its path. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think about anything else. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my parents' faces, their expressions shifting from guilt to defensiveness, their words ringing hollow and empty. I felt betrayed, not just by my parents, but by the very fabric of our family. They had lied to us, they had cheated us, and they had stolen from their own daughter, all in the name of their own selfish desires. It was unforgivable. I knew I had to confront them. I couldn't let them get away with this. I couldn't let them pretend that everything was okay, that this was just a minor setback, a temporary inconvenience. I needed them to understand the magnitude of their actions, the depth of the pain they had caused. I waited until the next morning after Chloe had left for school to confront them. I needed to be alone with them, to have a frank and honest conversation, without the fear of further upsetting my sister. The silence of the house was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. I found them in the kitchen, Mom washing dishes at the sink, Dad reading the newspaper at the table. They looked up as I entered, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and defiance. "I didn't waste any time. How could you?" I said, my voice shaking with barely contained rage. "How could you do this to Chloe? How could you be so selfish? How could you lie to us for so long?" They tried to downplay it, to minimize their actions, to make excuses for their behavior. They talked about the sacrifices they'd made for us over the years, the burdens they'd carried, the difficult choices they'd had to make. They spoke about wanting to provide us with a good life, wanting to secure our future, wanting to give us everything we deserved. But I wasn't buying it. Their words were meaningless, hollow platitudes designed to deflect blame and minimize their culpability. The evidence of their betrayal was too stark, too undeniable. Their faces shifted between pride and betrayal. "You promised her," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but laced with steel. "You promised her that she could go to her dream school. You promised her her future. You looked her in the eye and told her that everything would be okay. And then you stole it all away from her." My dad exploded, his face turning red with anger. "You're being so dramatic, Sarah. We didn't steal anything. We just made a few adjustments to our financial plan. It's not the end of the world. She can still go to college. She can still have a good life." My mom started crying, her voice cracking with emotion. "Please, Sarah, you have to understand. We were just trying to do what we thought was best for the family. We didn't mean to hurt anyone. You are selfish and did not think about anyone else. You spent my dreams. How could you ruin our family? I don't even think I know who you are anymore." Then I said the words I thought I'd never say. "What about me? What about my education? What about all the sacrifices I made so that Chloe could pursue her dreams? You promised me that I would have a good education as well. But what about what happened to me? I am the one that got all the scholarships." I reminded them of all the times I had foregone opportunities, turned down invitations, and worked tirelessly to support Chloe's ambitions. I reminded them of the hours I had spent tutoring her, driving her to rehearsals, and cheering her on from the sidelines. I reminded them of all the promises they had made to me, promises that now seemed hollow and meaningless. "You could get your degree anywhere," said my mom, her voice rising in anger, defending their actions as if I was somehow being unreasonable. "It doesn't matter where you go to college. What matters is what you do with your life." "Yes, it matters," I snapped, my patience finally snapping. "It matters that you lied to me. It matters that you cheated me. It matters that you devalued my dreams just because they weren't as flashy or glamorous as Chloe's. We are selling her dream. You act like we don't matter. You acted like we did not deserve the same love or education." I screamed, my voice raw with emotion, tears streaming down my face. "How could you do this? How could you betray us like this? How could you be so cruel?" The carefully constructed facade of our family had finally crumbled, exposing the ugly truth that had been lurking beneath the surface for so long. They cared more about themselves, and their actions hurt me and Chloe. They hurt our family. In that moment, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The trust was gone, the love had been tainted, and the future I had envisioned for myself, for Chloe, for our family, had been irrevocably destroyed. I stood in silence, knowing there was one thing left for me to do. Then I knew what I had to do. If my parents wouldn't fix it, I had to. Part 4: The Plan. The house felt suffocating. The air was thick with resentment, and the lingering scent of broken promises. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. I needed to escape, to clear my head, to figure out a way to salvage Chloe's future. I grabbed my keys and phone and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for hours, the landscape blurring past in a haze of anger and frustration. I replayed the confrontation with my parents over and over in my head, each time fueling my rage and solidifying my resolve. I knew I could count on my friends and Chloe, but my parents? I couldn't rely on my parents to fix this. They were too deep in denial, too consumed by their own selfishness, too blinded by their own flawed logic. They were the problem, not the solution. I knew it was up to me, and only me, to save Chloe's dream, to find a way to get her to New York, to make sure she had the opportunity she deserved. I pulled over to the side of the road, the setting sun casting long shadows across the fields. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts, to focus my energy on finding a solution. I had to come up with a plan. A viable, actionable plan that could generate enough money to cover Chloe's expenses. It felt like an impossible task, a Herculean feat that was beyond my capabilities. But I refused to give up. I owed it to Chloe, and I owed it to myself to try. I started brainstorming, mentally listing all the resources at my disposal. I had a good job, even if I had little work experience. I could pick up extra shifts, work overtime, sacrifice my weekends and evenings to earn more money. I did get a lot of shifts, but it was only a little bit of money. But would that be enough? I already had rent and student loans. It wasn't going to be enough to cover her cost of attendance. I'd always been a good student, dedicated and hardworking, but now I knew that if I really wanted to make this plan work, I'd have to find a way to make a lot of money and make it fast. What did I have to offer? Were there any skills I possessed that could be monetized? Any talents I could leverage? I could tutor other students. But my parents would want the money from that. I thought about the most valuable thing my parents had that could be sold. They didn't have much. They had drained their savings to fund their lavish lifestyle, leaving us with nothing. The car was leased, the house was mortgaged, and their possessions were mostly worthless trinkets and outdated appliances. But I knew how valuable the information they held could be. They had always been discreet, secretive about their business dealings, careful to protect their privacy. But I knew enough to understand that they had connections, that they knew people who were involved in less than reputable activities. They had talked on the phone in code, and I had often overheard information from them. It had never mattered until now. I remembered snippets of conversations, fleeting glimpses of documents, hushed whispers about deals and transactions. It was a long shot, a risky gamble, but it was the only thing I could think of that had the potential to generate the kind of money we needed. I had to think of Chloe. I had a lot of friends, close friends I had made over the years, friends who believed in me, friends who trusted me. They needed help with a lot of the activities my parents were doing, and the connections I had. I knew a few would do what it took to help me, and it would also solve their problems. I could use the money that my friends could give me, and also the money my parents would be giving the other folks. I could solve two problems with one stone. I knew I was good at taking care of myself, at making difficult decisions, at navigating complex situations. I was resourceful, resilient, and determined. And now it was Chloe's turn. It was time for me to step up, to take control, to do whatever it took to make her dream a reality. I trusted my friends knew what to do. I decided to do something that would truly shock my parents. Something they wouldn't see coming. Something that would make them realize the gravity of their actions, the consequences of their betrayal. The only way Chloe could get to school would be if I had a plan to get a hold of a lot of money. What my parents did was wrong, and there was something I had to do about it. I told them that I was leaving, that I was moving far away from their lies and their deception. I was not their daughter. I did not have to listen to their lies and games, that I would do whatever I needed to do. The next step was a simple one. Make them happy. That will leave our lives, and we will be able to live our lives happily without your shadow in the way, said my mom with a sigh. They wanted me gone, and that was okay, because now I could work freely. I knew that was not going to be the case. I needed to make them believe that they were finally free from my presence. The only way was to leave, and trust my friends. The storm of anger and determination was gathering within me, ready to unleash its full fury on those who had wronged us. Part 5. The shocking reveal. I disappeared for a few weeks, slipping away from the suffocating confines of our family home and immersing myself in a world of shadows and secrets. I told my parents that I was going to the mountains, seeking solitude and clarity, needing time to process everything that had happened. They feigned concern, but I saw a flicker of relief in their eyes, a sense of freedom now that I was no longer around to challenge their decisions or question their motives. In reality, I wasn't in the mountains. I was working closely with my friends, orchestrating a meticulously planned operation designed to expose my parents' lies and reclaim what they had stolen from Chloe. I had a long and important relationship with those friends, and I had asked them to help. I laid low for several days, meeting with my contacts, gathering information, and solidifying my strategy. I spent hours poring over documents, reviewing financial records, and piecing together the puzzle of my parents' deceitful dealings. The more I learned, the more disgusted I became. Their greed knew no bounds. My contacts did what was needed to be done. I kept in contact with Chloe, offering her words of encouragement and reassurance, promising her that I would do everything in my power to make her dream a reality. I couldn't tell her the details of my plan for her own safety, but I wanted her to know that I was fighting for her, that I wouldn't rest until justice was served. I knew this was a high-stakes game, a dangerous dance with forces beyond my control. But I was willing to risk everything, to sacrifice everything, to make sure that Chloe had the opportunity she deserved. My parents were going to get their just desserts. Then, after weeks of careful planning and meticulous execution, I was ready to return. My parents, now ensconced in a lavish new home that they had purchased with the embezzled funds, looked surprised to see me. The old house was now completely empty. The car was gone. All signs of our past had been erased, replaced by a facade of wealth and prosperity. The lavish renovations would be what brought them down. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" said my mom, her voice laced with a mixture of suspicion and apprehension. "We thought you were in the mountains." I smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down her spine. I said, my voice soft but firm. "I needed some time to think, to clear my head. And now I'm back. I have a surprise for you." "What is it?" said my dad, his eyes narrowing, sensing that something was amiss. "We have some people that want to see you, in case you wanted to go to a restaurant," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "They're very interested in your financial arrangements." As if on cue, a team of law enforcement officers, led by a stern-faced detective, entered the house, their presence filling the room with an aura of authority and dread. Their faces reflected no sympathy. "What's going on?" said my dad, his face paling with alarm. "What is this about?" "You did this," he said, turning to me, his eyes blazing with fury. "You betrayed us? After everything we've done for you?" "Yes," I said, my voice unwavering, my gaze fixed on his, "and I had nothing to do with the home." I could see the shock in their eyes. Their faces became paralyzed and they looked at each other. They were lost. The college fund was embezzled to fund this entire home. These renovations, your new car, your lavish vacations. I continued, my voice ringing with righteous indignation. The people in the mountains weren't hikers or tourists. They were investigators, gathering evidence of your crimes. You're going to have to answer for your actions. I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a whisper, my eyes filled with a cold, unyielding fury. "You are going to jail," I said, "for stealing Chloe's dream, for betraying our family, and for stealing my education and everything I did to get there. I am going to see Chloe get her dream, even if it's the last thing I do." They were speechless, their faces pale with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and regret. They were utterly defeated, their carefully constructed world crumbling around them. They had been so consumed by their own selfishness, so blinded by their own greed, that they hadn't seen this coming. But their daughter came. The police handcuffed them, leading them out of the house and into a waiting patrol car. As they were driven away, I watched them go, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. I had achieved my goal, but the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that I had destroyed my own family in the process. Chloe went to her dream school, flourished in her studies, and blossomed into the talented and confident young woman I always knew she could be. She worked hard, excelled in her classes, and eventually landed a coveted role in a Broadway production, fulfilling her lifelong dream. I, meanwhile, worked hard, saved my money, and built a successful life for myself, finally getting the education that I had always wanted. It wasn't the path I had originally envisioned, but it was my own, forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the strength of my convictions. My parents, meanwhile, were in prison, serving time for their crimes. They hadn't just stolen a college fund. They'd stolen our trust, our family, our future. And for that, they had paid the ultimate price. Years passed. I visited them a few times, but the conversations were strained, awkward, and ultimately unsatisfying. They couldn't understand why I had done what I had done, why I had betrayed them. They still saw themselves as the victims, as the ones who had been wronged. But I knew the truth. They had reaped what they had sown. And their words, their faces, their actions would haunt them forever. And as for me, I had found a way to move on, to rebuild my life, to create a future filled with purpose, meaning, and the unwavering love and support of my sister. The future I planned with Chloe and my friends was perfect. My friends, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and write a comment, and we begin. Part 1. The letter. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawn of our suburban home, a picture of domestic tranquility. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of lilies, a bouquet I had bought myself earlier that day, a futile attempt to brighten the mood that had settled over our house in the last few weeks. I'd been trying so hard to ignore the growing distance between me and Daniel, the subtle shift in his demeanor, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine anymore. I knew I should have said something about it, but I was afraid of what he would say back. I was making dinner, a simple pasta dish with pesto, one of Daniel's favorites. I had even gone to the store to pick up some fresh basil from the farmer's market, hoping to entice him to open up, to reconnect. The sound of the front door opening startled me. I called out a cheerful greeting, expecting to see Daniel's familiar face, but the silence that followed was unsettling. Then I heard the distinct thud of the mail hitting the hallway floor, a sound I was intimately familiar with, the daily ritual of checking the mail. I hadn't noticed the postman. My phone rang at the same time, and I was on the phone with Sarah, my best friend, when I heard it. My heart did not hurt. I was used to not having Daniel around. I went to pick it up, and that's when I saw the envelope. My heart clenched as I looked at the thick white envelope, the sterile, impersonal font of my married name, Mrs. Olivia Sterling, typed in a cold, almost clinical style. The return address was the office of Robert Caldwell, attorney at law. Robert Caldwell, the name of the attorney. A name that was, until this moment, completely foreign to me. I immediately knew, with a sickening certainty, that this was not a friendly letter, not a birthday card, not an invitation to a social event. This was something else entirely. This was something that would change my life forever. I knew there was no good reason for an attorney to contact me unless it was for something bad. A chill ran down my spine, raising the hairs on my arms. I reached for the letter, my fingers trembling, as if I already knew the devastating contents within. My fingers would become numb. It was time to call Amanda. We had been married for 7 years. 7 years of what I had genuinely believed was happiness, built on a foundation of mutual respect, love, and a shared vision for our future. We had built a life together, brick by brick, a beautiful home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood, a cozy haven filled with laughter, shared meals, and the comfortable rhythm of daily life. We had a close circle of friends, couples who we had bonded with over the years, sharing countless memories and supporting each other through thick and thin. There was no dramatic history of fighting, no explosive arguments, no accusations of infidelity or abuse. In fact, the opposite was true. Our relationship had been characterized by a quiet, steady affection, a deep and abiding bond that I believed was strong enough to withstand the tests of time. We had our disagreements, of course, the usual squabbles that all couples experience, but they were always resolved quickly, with a compromise or a heartfelt apology. Daniel and I were good together, in the ways you would expect. We had been a perfect fit. That was one of the reasons why I had been so excited to marry Daniel. I had not loved other people, and he was nice and good. I believed in the sanctity of marriage, in the power of commitment, in the enduring strength of a loving partnership. I thought it was the best thing I would ever do. But lately, things had felt off. Subtly, insidiously off. Daniel had been distant, emotionally closed off, spending long, irregular hours at work and offering vague, unsatisfying excuses for his absences. He'd been preoccupied, his mind elsewhere, his attention wandering. He'd been emotionally unavailable, shutting me out, withdrawing from intimacy. I had tried, desperately, to connect with him, to reach out, to understand what was going on. But my attempts had been met with polite indifference, evasive answers, and a growing wall of silence. He did not want to tell me his worries, or what was happening. I'd brushed it off as stress, as work pressures, as the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. I told myself that it was just a phase, that things would eventually improve. But a persistent, unsettling unease had taken root in my heart, a feeling that something was profoundly wrong. The days were getting longer. It had been a long time. With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope and unfolded the letter, my hands already starting to become numb. The simple act felt monumental, as if I was tearing down a wall. The words swam before my eyes, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. I blinked, took a deep breath, and forced myself to focus. I had to know what this meant. I had to understand. The letter was short, stark, terse, and brutal in its simplicity. It was typed on a single sheet of expensive, embossed stationery, and the language was cold, formal, and devoid of any personal warmth. It stated that Daniel, my husband, the man I had pledged my life to, was seeking a divorce. It cited irreconcilable differences as the reason for the split, a vague, meaningless term that offered no real explanation, no insight into the sudden and devastating turn of events. The letter offered no apology, no regrets, no attempt to soften the blow. I began to get a strong headache, but I continued on, reading slowly. The letter went on to say that all future communication regarding the matter should be directed through his attorney, Robert Caldwell. All future communication. The idea that Daniel had hired a lawyer before telling me that the conversation I had had with my husband was more an act, and not because he loved me, filled my mind with pain. All communication through my lawyer. The phrase echoed in my mind, a cold, formal declaration of war, a calculated maneuver designed to sever all ties, to remove himself entirely from the emotional complexities of our shared life. It was a strategic move, a legal maneuver that reduced our 7 years of marriage, our shared dreams and aspirations, to a mere transaction. It was as if Daniel had erased me from his life, reduced me to a legal formality, an inconvenient obstacle to be removed with cold efficiency. I stared at the letter, frozen in place, numb with shock and disbelief. I read it again and again, scrutinizing every word, searching for some hidden meaning, some sign that this was all a terrible, heartbreaking mistake. But the words remained unchanged, stark and unforgiving, a testament to a decision that had already been made, a future that had already been determined. Everything was a lie. The pasta was already overcooked and sitting on the stove. Part 2, the reply. The initial shock, the numb disbelief, the crushing weight of the letter's revelation. It all crashed down on me at once. I crumpled to the floor, the expensive Persian rug doing little to cushion the blow. The carefully curated image of our perfect life, our perfect marriage, shattered into a million jagged pieces, the fragments cutting me with every breath. I was supposed to be making dinner. I had been smiling earlier. How could everything have fallen apart? What had gone wrong? I stared at the letter, my vision blurring with tears. The carefully controlled composure that I had maintained for so long finally shattered, giving way to a torrent of raw, unadulterated emotion. I sobbed uncontrollably, my body racked with grief and anger. I screamed Daniel's name, a desperate plea for understanding, a futile attempt to undo what had been done. But the silence of the house was deafening, amplifying my sense of isolation and despair. The perfectly cooked pesto pasta sat untouched on the stove, now growing cold, a stark symbol of our broken life, our ruined future. I didn't move, lost in the darkness of my grief. The heat was suffocating and the room started to spin. I finally decided to call someone and dialed Sarah, my best friend, her number etched in my memory from years of late-night confessions and whispered secrets. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and familiar, a comforting lifeline in the storm. "Liv? You okay?" Her voice was filled with a tenderness I appreciated. I burst into tears again, the words tumbling out in a jumbled, incoherent mess. I managed to convey the essence of what had happened, the letter, the divorce, the cold, calculated manner in which Daniel had ended our marriage. I kept on talking and repeating myself. Sarah listened patiently, her voice a calming presence in the midst of my emotional turmoil. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes or empty assurances. She simply listened, allowing me to vent, to rage, to grieve. "Oh, Liv," she said softly when I finally ran out of steam. "I'm so sorry. That's just awful. What a complete jerk." It was a brief, simple summary, but I loved it. I knew it had not been a good marriage, but it was never supposed to have ended like this. She asked questions, gentle probes designed to help me process what had happened, to understand the details of Daniel's betrayal. But I had no answers to give. I was just as confused, just as bewildered as she was. All I knew was that my life had been irrevocably altered and that I was facing an uncertain future. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern. "Are you going to talk to him? Fight it?" That was the question that had been swirling in my mind since I had read the letter. I wanted to scream, to rage, to confront Daniel and demand an explanation. I wanted to beg him to reconsider, to fight for our marriage, to salvage what was left of our shattered life. But I knew, deep down, that wouldn't do any good. Daniel had made his decision. He had drawn his line in the sand. And any attempt to reach out to him, to plead with him, to reason with him, would only be met with the cold, impersonal wall of his lawyer. It was time to accept defeat, to regroup, and to plan my next move. I had to think clearly. "What do you think? Is he a good guy?" I asked her. Sarah laughed. "You know he's not," she replied. Sarah had always hated Daniel and had no problem telling me. It had been a problem in our relationship at the beginning, but I realized that she was telling the truth. I started to see it too. After a long discussion about our future plans, I decided to take a nap. When I woke up, the plan was beginning to formulate. I was a paralegal, I reminded myself, a legal professional trained to navigate the complexities of the legal system. I knew my rights, and I knew how to protect them. I could do this. I thought about everything for a very long time, so I decided that I needed a plan. I spent the next few hours pacing, ranting, and crying to Sarah over the phone, drawing strength from her unwavering support. But deep down, I knew that I was on my own. This was my battle, and I had to fight it on my own terms with my own weapons. Finally, after much deliberation, after weighing all the options, I decided on my response. I knew Daniel was expecting me to be emotional, to be distraught, to plead with him to come back. He was expecting me to fight it, to make a scene, to create a mess. But I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. I wouldn't let him see my pain. I had to show him that I was strong, that I was in control, that I wouldn't be easily defeated. I needed to take time and figure out what I was going to do, how I was going to respond to this devastating blow. And the first step was to regain my composure, to reclaim my power. I sat down at my computer, my fingers trembling slightly as I typed a short, simple email to Robert Caldwell, Daniel's lawyer. Understood. 2 words. 14 characters. A message devoid of emotion, devoid of explanation, devoid of any indication of my inner turmoil. It was a deliberate choice, a calculated act of defiance. I was denying Daniel the satisfaction of seeing me break, of knowing that he had wounded me. I was signaling that I was ready to play his game, to fight him on his own terms, using his own rules. I attached a scan of my own lawyer's information, Amanda, to the email, a subtle but powerful message that I was not going to face this battle alone, that I had someone on my side, someone who would fight for my interests. I double-checked the email, making sure there were no typos, no inadvertent displays of emotion. It was cold, efficient, and impersonal, just like Daniel's letter. I hit send and closed my laptop, a strange sense of calm settling over me. The calm before the storm. Daniel wanted a divorce. Fine. He wanted to communicate through lawyers. Fine. He wanted to treat me like a stranger. Fine. I would play his game, but I would play it my way. And I would win. Part 3. The investigation. The days that followed felt surreal, like I was living in a movie, watching my life unfold from a distance. The initial shock and grief slowly began to subside, replaced by a cold, steely determination. I had made my decision. I would fight. Not for Daniel, not for our broken marriage, but for myself. Amanda, my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being a formidable opponent, advised me to gather as much information as possible. She emphasized the importance of knowing what I was up against, of understanding Daniel's motivations and his potential strategies. "We need to understand what he's trying to get out of this divorce, Olivia," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "We need to know what he's hiding. What his financial resources are, who he's been associating with, what his plans are for the future. The more we know, the better prepared we'll be to protect your interests." She was right. Information was power, and I was determined to amass as much power as I could. I started slowly, taking small steps each day, feeling more certain and less sad. I'm good at finding information. It was one of my strengths, a skill honed through years of working as a paralegal, sifting through mountains of documents, piecing together fragments of evidence, and uncovering hidden truths. I did not see my sadness lasting for too long, but this was different. This wasn't just a case, it was my life. And the person I was investigating was the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, the man who had betrayed me. I was determined to dig deeper, to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I started by quietly accessing our joint bank accounts and credit card statements, meticulously reviewing every transaction for any sign of unusual activity. I scanned for large withdrawals, suspicious transfers, unexplained expenses. I felt like I was invading Daniel's privacy, but I justified it as necessary self-defense. He had already invaded my life, and he had to be stopped. I also discreetly contacted some of our mutual friends, the couples we had shared so many meals with. My parents told me not to contact them. Daniel probably was also telling them not to contact me. These people had always mattered to me, but they were now being taken away. I tried to talk to them, to feel them out, probing for any hints or rumors about Daniel's behavior. I asked casual questions about his work, his hobbies, his state of mind. I watched their faces closely, analyzing their words for any clues that might shed light on his sudden decision to end our marriage. But they always diverted me away from my questions or said that they had not heard anything. I did not know what to do. I listened carefully to their stories, their anecdotes, their casual observations, searching for any inconsistencies, any red flags, any indication that they knew more than they were letting on. But the thing I was looking for never came. What had happened? Why? I started to feel like I was going crazy. I wasn't sleeping, I wasn't eating, I wasn't functioning. The house felt empty and silent. I was starting to think I could not work this way for long. I was losing it. I was starting to feel like I had imagined the whole thing. But then I thought of Chloe, and I knew I needed to keep on going. Then, just when I was about to give up, just when I thought I had exhausted all my leads, I found it. A series of suspicious withdrawals from our joint savings account, labeled as business expenses. The withdrawals were recent, frequent, and for substantial amounts of money. The first one had been about 3 months ago. The payments were frequent, and were being used to pay for restaurants that I had never heard of before, and that were in another city. These restaurants were also ridiculously expensive, like some fine dining establishments that I knew Daniel would not eat at, and the money added up to a lot of money. I knew this was not right. I knew I was on to something. This was the clue I had been searching for, the thread that would unravel the truth. Part 4: The Discovery. Fueled by a mixture of anger, suspicion, and a desperate need for answers, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the business expenses. I looked up the business name listed in the financial records and discovered it was a small tech company, seemingly innocuous, located in another city, a city I had never visited. It also occurred to me that the people that did work there never seemed to show their faces anywhere. The information was scarce, the company's online presence minimal. There was no website, no social media profiles, no trace of its existence beyond a listing in a business directory. The lack of information only heightened my suspicions. It felt deliberate, as if the company was actively trying to avoid attention. I searched for the names of the people who were associated with the business, the owners, the employees, the investors, but found nothing concrete. The names I did find were generic and untraceable, leading me to suspect that they were aliases, fabricated identities designed to conceal the truth. Nothing felt real. I felt stuck. Everything was coming up as fake. I called different numbers and different names that I found online, but there was no answer. only voicemails and dead ends. It felt like the truth was deliberately obscured, hidden behind a veil of secrecy. I had almost given up. I thought, what was even the point? It was too hard. But I knew Chloe was always there. I knew my parents were evil. I needed to keep going for myself. I booked a flight. I flew down to that city, a city that I had never been to before, a city that held the key to unlocking the mystery surrounding Daniel's behavior. The plane was dark, and my mind was racing. I did not know what to do. I was running out of resources. The moment I landed, I felt a sense of foreboding, a heavy weight settling over me. The city was unfamiliar, the streets crowded, the buildings impersonal. I felt like an outsider, a stranger in a strange land, searching for something I couldn't quite define. I found the address I had, and then I found the building. It was a rundown office building, a gray tower that looked like it had been there for 50 years, its facade worn and faded. I thought about how fancy our home was. I did not understand why someone would live like this. I went inside and found the suite that contained the company's office. The door was locked, the windows were darkened, and there was no sign of activity. It was as if the company had vanished into thin air. A sign on the door said, "Closed for repairs." But the company was listed as available for business. I felt defeated. I wanted to be done. I tried to be patient, and then I saw her. Daniel and another woman, laughing as they strolled down the street. They were laughing, and the sun was warm on their faces. They were smiling at each other like the world was their own. The scene reminded me of Daniel and I. Her arm was linked through his, their bodies pressed close together, their movements synchronized. She was beautiful, younger than me, with long blonde hair that cascaded down her back, and a dazzling smile that lit up her face. They looked like a couple, happy and in love, completely oblivious to the pain and devastation they were causing. Everything that I had given to Daniel was being given to her. My heart sank. I wasn't surprised, not really, but it didn't make it any less painful. The sight of them together, so carefree and intimate, was like a punch to the gut. So that was it. He was leaving me for another woman. A woman with everything I would never be, everything I would never have. Daniel had not loved me. I wanted to run away from the truth, from the pain, from the overwhelming sense of betrayal. But I couldn't. I had come too far, invested too much. I needed to see this through. I followed them, keeping a safe distance as they strolled hand in hand down the street, their laughter echoing in my ears. They went into a fancy restaurant, a place I had always wanted to go to, but that Daniel had always refused to take me to. I couldn't bring myself to confront them. Not yet. I was in shock. I needed to think, to plan, to figure out what to do next. This was the most painful moment of my life. Then, a rush of strength took over me. I knew what I had to do. I was going to show them how wrong they were. I was going to fight. Part 5. The Checkmate. I returned to my sterile hotel room, the image of Daniel and the other woman seared into my mind. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, calculating anger. I had seen enough. I knew the truth, and now it was time to act. I was finally ready for this day to be over. I needed to move forward, and I needed to make sure my parents knew what happened. Daniel would not win. I spent the rest of the night piecing together the puzzle, connecting the dots, and solidifying my plan. I re-examined the financial records, cross-referencing the suspicious transactions with the woman's name, which I had managed to obtain through some discreet inquiries. The truth was damning. Daniel had been secretly transferring money from our joint accounts to her for months, funding her lavish lifestyle, paying for her expensive clothes, her fancy dinners, her luxurious vacations. I could not believe the lengths he had gone to do this. He had created a dummy corporation, a shell company designed to conceal his fraudulent activities. He had used it as a conduit to funnel money to his mistress, disguising the transfers as legitimate business expenses. He had systematically looted our joint assets, draining our savings, jeopardizing our financial security, all for his own selfish gain. It wasn't just about leaving me, about breaking our vows, about seeking pleasure in another woman's arms. It was about theft, about deceit, about systematically dismantling our life together for his own selfish gain. This was not the Daniel I had married. This was a monster, a con artist, a predator. The tears threatened to return, but I pushed them back. I had no time for grief, no time for self-pity. I had a mission to accomplish. The next morning, after a fitful night of restless sleep, I called Amanda, my lawyer, and told her everything. I recounted the events of the previous day, the discovery of the business expenses, the trip to the other city, the sighting of Daniel and the woman, the evidence of his fraudulent activity. She listened intently, her silence punctuated by occasional gasps of disbelief and outrage. "This is gold, Olivia," she said, her voice sharp and decisive. "This changes everything. We can not only get you a favorable divorce settlement, but we can also press charges against him for fraud and embezzlement. We can go after everything he's gained through his deceit. We could take him apart completely." I had to show her what that had happened. "I want everything, Amanda," I said, my voice cold and determined, devoid of any emotion. "I want him to pay for what he's done. I want him to lose everything he's gained through his lies and deceit. I want him to suffer the consequences of his actions." It was time for Daniel to answer for his choices. I then contacted the IRS and provided them with all the evidence I had gathered. I knew that Daniel had been evading taxes for years, hiding income, inflating expenses, and engaging in other shady accounting practices. I wanted him to face the full force of the law, to be held accountable for his financial crimes. Amanda filed the divorce papers, including a detailed accounting of Daniel's financial improprieties. She also contacted the authorities, providing them with all the evidence of his fraudulent activities, urging them to launch a full-scale investigation. The plan I had was complete. A few weeks later, the hammer came down. Daniel was arrested on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. His assets were frozen, his reputation was ruined, and his life was turned upside down. The truth that was hidden was finally out, exposed for all the world to see. I saw him being taken down in the news. It was real. When Daniel called, desperate, pleading, begging for forgiveness, I did not answer. Instead, Amanda, my lawyer, intercepted the call, informing him that all communication should be directed through her office. It was a taste of his own medicine, a dose of the cold, impersonal treatment he had so readily dispensed to me. As for the divorce settlement, I got everything. The house, the savings, the investments, the assets. I took everything I was entitled to, and then some. I was not going to make the same mistake again. I also demanded a public apology, a full confession of his crimes, a written statement acknowledging the pain and suffering he had caused me. He refused, clinging to his pride, unwilling to admit his guilt. But I didn't care. The truth was out, and that was enough. I did not need him to apologize. A year later, Daniel was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to several years in prison, his once privileged life reduced to a cold, sterile cell. The beautiful young woman, it turned out, was also scamming him, taking advantage of his wealth and his desperation. He had been a victim of his own desires. He had made his bed, and he had to lie in it. As for me, I picked up the pieces of my life and moved on. It wasn't easy. The scars of betrayal ran deep, but I was stronger than I thought. I had survived a heartbreak, conquered adversity, and emerged victorious. I could do anything. I was not living my parents' life anymore, and I was going to go where I wanted. I was living my own life, building a future filled with purpose, passion, and genuine connections. I had sold the house, invested wisely, and started a new career, doing something that truly fulfilled me. I never wanted to become as evil as my parents had been. I had gotten a new dog. My new best friend would always stay by my side. Sometimes playing the game by their rules, mastering their strategies, and turning their own weapons against them is the best way to win. And sometimes, the greatest victory is simply walking away, leaving them to face the consequences of their actions, while you create a life filled with joy, love, and authenticity.